Throughout history, women's achievements have often been overlooked, yet so many have played crucial roles in developing the America we know today. One woman who you probably have not heard of in your history class is Nellie Bly.
Elizabeth Jane Cochran, known by her pen name Nellie Bly, was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania on May 5, 1864. She was the 13th daughter of Michael Cochran, a local mill owner, and Mary Jane Kennedy. Both of her parents had been married previously, but remarried after their spouses died. Her father devoted himself to providing for the family by working his way up from being a local mill laborer to a judge. However, when Nellie was 6 years old, her father died suddenly. This loss was especially difficult on Nellie's family, as he had left them without a will, and therefore no legal claim to his estate. When Nellie was older, she enrolled at a small college in Indiana, Pennsylvania, where she studied to become a teacher. Unfortunately, due to the financial strain that paying for college had on her family, she was unable to continue with her education. She eventually moved in with her mother, and together they ran a boarding house. Nellie began her iconic career as a journalist during the year 1885. She was hired as a reporter for the Pittsburgh Dispatch, as she had impressed the editor by sending an angry letter in response to an article that the company had printed. The article was titled, "What Girls Are Good For," and it offended Nellie deeply. However, when the Dispatch refused to allow Bly to report on topics beyond the, quote, society pages, she quit her job and decided to find work in New York City. Bly faced rejection from many newspapers, as most of them admitted biases towards women as reporters. Finally, in 1887, Bly managed a meeting with Colonel John Cockrell, the managing editor of New York World newspaper. It was there that Nellie wasn't restricted to only writing women's pages, but was able to report on many topics, the conditions that working girls faced in Pittsburgh, the lives of the people in poverty, and more. She raised awareness, and her muckraking journalism advanced the cause of people that few wished to support, and was crucial to reform movements. In 1886 through 1887, Bly traveled to and from Mexico, working as a foreign correspondent, and would send back reports on the country's governmental corruption and the worsening condition of the impoverished. Mexican officials were angered by her exposing their unethical practices, and this resulted in her having to leave the country. Her work there was ahead of its time, and included witty commentary such as, "American food is insipid in comparison." Nellie promised her editor that she could report on major stories. He was impressed and gave her an incredible assignment, to investigate the treatment of residents at an insane asylum. She was instructed to go undercover, but was given no guidance on how to get in or get out. Bly hoped that she could get herself admitted to the Women's Insane Asylum Blackwell by staying at a boarding house and acting mentally unwell. Her plan worked, and she was sent to Blackwell for 10 days after being pronounced insane by 4 separate doctors. Her reports were terrifying and extremely upsetting to the public when she wrote her scandalous exposé on how the residents were treated. She described how they were given spoiled food, ice-cold baths, and how threadbare the clothes were despite the freezing autumn draft in their rooms. Nellie wanted to talk with as many residents as she could, and discovered that many of them were trapped in a cycle. Some women thought that it was a poorhouse, and others who did not understand English were mistakenly assumed to be insane, and they all would be admitted, but if they cried or complained, they would get beaten by brooms. If these women tried to report the abuse, they would not be taken seriously by doctors due to their, quote, mental conditions. It was horrifying. Many women at Blackwell described miserable stories of cruelty and neglect. After her stay, Bly's exposé was published, and it spread like wildfire. Her personal account of what occurred in the asylum shocked the country. The story was so popular that fellow newspapers produced their own reports of Nellie's visit to the asylum as a way to join in on the fame and profit. City officials learned of Bly's trip to Blackwell, and they investigated the institution. A jury panel went with Bly to visit the asylum. However, the people who had told Bly of their maltreatment had already been released or transferred. The buildings had been cleaned, and the patient care had been elevated. Thankfully, the city officials believed in Bly telling the truth and added nearly $1 million to the asylum's budget. Bly's experiences were kept in a book and published, titled 10 Days in a Madhouse. Bly's journalism sparked a movement towards bettering the care of people with mental illnesses. Another remarkable feat of Nellie Bly was her record-breaking trip around the world in just 72 days. 31 years before women were allowed to vote, Bly defied societal norms and courageously traveled across the entire globe, unaccompanied. She hoped to prove that women were as capable of traveling as men were. She did not pack much. With her she brought a small traveler's bag, the dress she wore, and a cape. This further broke down stereotypes around women, as they were expected to need several outfits and toiletries. Bly traveled through England, France, China, Japan, and more. This introduced international travel and culture to citizens back in the United States, and made her name even more famous. She was featured on board games and lectured across the country. Her experience of what she encountered on this trip was collected in her novel, Around the World in 72 Days.
After her impressive trip, Bly decided to quit reporting and begin a profitable career in writing novels for the New York Family Story paper. Between the years of 1889 and 1895, Bly had written 11 novels. Few copies of these papers survived, so her novels were thought to be gone, until in 2021, when author David Blix announced their discovery. In 1895, Nellie married Robert Seaman, a millionaire manufacturer. Bly was 31 and Seaman was 73 when they were married. Bly took a break from being a journalist and succeeded her husband as head of the ironclad manufacturing company due to her husband's failing health. The company made steel containers such as milk cans and boilers. 9 years after they were married, Seaman passed away. There have been claims that Bly invented a steel barrel that was the model for the 55-gallon oil drum still in use in the United States today, but the inventor is registered under a different name. However, Nellie Bly was an inventor in her own right of other items. She received U.S. patents for both a milk can and a stacking garbage can. As she was now head of her late husband's steel company, she was one of few women industrialists in America. Under her care, the company became a model of social welfare, complete with health benefits and recreational facilities for the workers. Unfortunately, the company went bankrupt due to her negligence and the embezzlement by a factory manager. Bly returned to journalism and reported on stories from Europe's Eastern Front during World War I. She was one of the first foreigners and also the first woman to visit the war zone between Austria and Serbia. Bly also worked for the New York Evening Journal and reported on the women's suffrage procession of 1913. The article was titled, "Suffragists Are Men's Superiors," and in it, Bly predicted with startling accuracy that women in America would not gain the right to vote until the year 1920. On January 27, 1922, Nellie Bly died of pneumonia at St. Mark's Hospital in New York City. She was 57 years old. Nellie Bly was an icon and paved the way for numerous reform movements. She was one of the first women in investigative journalism and was also a minority rights advocate and a famous adventurer. Bly devoted herself to bettering the world around her. She changed the way Americans viewed the rights of women, people with mental illnesses, factory workers, and many more. Since her death, she has been featured in plays, movies, books, and on stamps, cards, and more. Americans today continue to be inspired by the work she did. Nellie Bly was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame in 1998.